Oregon sells itself on rainforests, coastlines, and craft coffee. But inland, past the Cascades, past the high desert, past the places the highways skip, there are towns that time didn't just forget, it buried them. Some died when the ore ran out. Some died when the railroad moved one valley over. Some died for reasons that still don't make complete sense. These are 11 of those places, and most people have driven within an hour of them without ever knowing they existed. 12. Granite. Granite sits in the Blue Mountains of Grant County, and when gold was discovered there in 1862, the rush came fast and hard. Miners flooded the canyon, claims were staked overnight, and a town assembled itself from raw lumber and ambition in a matter of months. At its peak, Granite had saloons, a hotel, a newspaper, and enough permanent residents to incorporate as a city. It had the feel of something that intended to last. The gold thinned, and the people followed it out. By the early 20th century, Granite was down to a handful of residents clinging to ranching and stubborn habit. Today, the official population is somewhere between 2 and 8, depending on the season. The original buildings are still standing, weathered, listing, but intact. Granite is one of the few Oregon ghost towns that never fully died, which makes it harder to categorize and stranger to visit. 11. Cornucopia. Cornucopia, in the Wallowa Mountains near the Idaho border, was built around a gold mine that ran so deep into the mountain that miners eventually stopped measuring horizontal distance and started measuring vertically. The Lucky Bart and Union Companion mines bored thousands of feet into the rock through the late 1800s and into the 20th century, and the ore they pulled out was rich enough to keep the operation running long after comparable camps had quit. The mine finally closed in 1941, and the town emptied almost immediately after. What the Wallowas preserved is remarkable. Original mill structures, cabin foundations, and mine entrances still visible in the steep terrain above the ghost town site. The mountains that made Cornucopia difficult to reach in 1880 are the same mountains that protected what it left behind. Most of it is still there, exactly where the last shift walked away from it. 10. Hardman. Hardman is not a mining town, knowing they existed, and that alone makes it unusual in Oregon ghost town history. It was a wheat farming community established in Morrow County in the 1870s, built around the agricultural potential of the high desert plateau. At its modest peak, it had a post office, a school, a church, and enough commercial activity to sustain a small downtown. It was never spectacular. It was just a town where people lived and worked and raised families for several generations. The combination of rural depopulation, improved roads that drew residents toward larger centers, and the slow economic squeeze on small-scale dry land farming emptied Hardman across the mid-20th century. What remains is a cluster of original wooden buildings in various states of collapse, standing in the high desert with no interpretive signs and almost no visitors. Nobody made Hardman a heritage site. It just got left, which is exactly why it still looks like itself. 9. Golden. Golden was established in Josephine County in southern Oregon in the 1850s, initially as a supply point for the surrounding mining districts, before developing a small agricultural identity of its own. It was never a large town, a few dozen families at its height, but it had a post office, a store, and a community church that the residents built with the kind of care that signals people who expected to stay. The church is still standing. It is one of the best preserved original structures in any Oregon ghost town, a white wooden building that has survived over a century and a half of southern Oregon weather without collapsing into itself. The Oregon State Park System now manages the site. The church interior is intact. The cemetery behind it holds the graves of the families who built Golden and watched it slowly stop being a place where anyone new arrived. The building outlasted everything else by decades. 8. Antelope. Antelope's original story is straightforward. A small ranching and supply community established in Wasco County in the 1870s, serving the high desert plateau east of the Cascades. It had a school, a hotel, a post office, and the quiet permanence of a town that knew its role and filled it without drama. For over a century, Antelope did exactly what it was built to do, and nothing more. Then, in 1981, followers of the Rajneesh movement began purchasing land nearby and eventually took over the town government entirely, renaming Antelope Rajneeshpuram and turning a quiet ranching community into the center of the largest bioterrorism attack in American history. The original residents fought back legally. The commune collapsed by 1985, and the town was renamed Antelope again. The population today is around 40. The episode is documented. What it did to the community underneath the headlines is something the remaining residents have spent decades trying to outlive. 7. Greenhorn. Greenhorn sits at over 6,000 feet elevation in Grant County, making it the highest incorporated city in Oregon, a distinction it holds with a permanent population that has, at various points, been recorded as 0. Gold brought miners to that altitude in the 1890s, and the camp that formed around the placer and lode deposits built up quickly into something resembling a proper town, with a post office and enough commercial infrastructure to sustain a season's worth of mining activity. The elevation that defined Greenhorn also limited it. The winters at 6,000 feet in the Blue Mountains are long and brutal, and the town was essentially uninhabitable for several months of every year. When the ore played out, nobody had strong enough reasons to endure those winters without the income that had justified them. Greenhorn still holds its incorporation. A handful of cabins survive. The city technically exists. Whether anyone is in it depends entirely on the time of year. 6. Sheniko. Sheniko in Wasco County was once the largest inland wool shipping point in the United States. That is not a minor distinction. In the early 1900s, the Columbia Southern Railway terminus there handled more wool than any other non-coastal point in the country. And the money that flowed through that operation built a substantial town, a hotel, a water tower, commercial blocks, and the infrastructure of a place that believed it was positioned permanently at the center of Oregon's agricultural economy. The railroad extended south and bypassed Sheniko's economic logic almost overnight. Without its role as a terminus, the town had no particular reason to exist, and the businesses that had built up around that function followed the rail traffic out. Sheniko declined steadily through the mid-20th century. The original hotel still stands and has operated intermittently as a destination for visitors who make the drive out. The water tower and several commercial buildings survive. The wool capital of the American interior is now a quiet stop on a 2-lane highway that most people never take. 5. Susanville. Most people know Susanville as a city in Northern California. Far fewer know that Oregon had its own Susanville, a small mining and ranching community in Grant County that operated through the late 19th and early 20th centuries before emptying out quietly and being largely erased from popular awareness. The Oregon Susanville never competed with its California namesake for attention, which is part of why almost nobody outside the county knows it existed. What remains is modest. Foundation outlines, a cemetery, and the kind of historical residue that requires genuine research to find. Susanville, Oregon never had the population or the production to generate the documentation that keeps ghost towns alive in public memory. It existed, it functioned, and it stopped. The people who can tell you about it are mostly working from county records and old maps. That level of obscurity is exactly what makes it worth knowing about. 4. Fort Umpqua. Fort Umpqua predates the Oregon ghost town era entirely. Established by the Hudson's Bay Company in 1836 as a fur trading post along the Umpqua River, it operated during the period when Oregon was still jointly occupied by Britain and the United States, and the question of who would ultimately control the Pacific Northwest was genuinely unresolved. The fort was a commercial outpost in contested territory, built not to last, but to extract value from the surrounding land, while extraction was possible. The fur trade collapsed as beaver populations were depleted, and European fashion shifted away from felt hats. The HBC abandoned Fort Umpqua in 1854. Nothing visible remains above ground. The site is known from historical records and archaeological surveys, not from any physical structure you can stand in front of. Fort Umpqua is a ghost town that never became a town, a place whose entire existence preceded the settlement patterns that would eventually define Oregon and whose disappearance left no physical trace whatsoever. 3. Sumpter. Sumpter, in Baker County, had a conventional gold rush history. Through the 1890s and early 1900s, a productive camp, a real town, a collapse when the ore ran thin. What makes Sumpter genuinely unusual is what happened after. A massive gold dredge was brought in to process the valley floor itself, chewing through gravel and earth and reassembling the landscape in long ridges of tailings that still define the valley today. The dredge didn't mine the mountain, It ate the ground the town had been standing on. The Sumpter Valley dredge is still there. It is 1,200 tons of floating machinery that processed over 9 million cubic yards of gravel across its operational life, and it sits in a pond of its own making in the middle of the tailings field it created. Oregon State Parks preserved it exactly where it stopped operating in 1954. You can walk through it. The machinery is intact. Sumpter is one of the few ghost towns where the thing that finished the town is better preserved than the town itself. 2. Copperfield. Copperfield was a construction camp that grew along the Snake River in Hell's Canyon during the building of a power dam in the early 1910s. It had saloons, gambling operations, and the general character of a place that exists specifically to separate working men from their wages with no particular legal interference. The Baker County Sheriff found the town ungovernable. The situation deteriorated until Oregon Governor Oswald West took the extraordinary step of declaring martial law in Copperfield in January 1914 and sending his personal secretary, a woman named Fern Hobbs, to oversee the operation. Hobbs arrived with the state militia, closed the saloons, confiscated the liquor, and dismantled Copperfield's entire vice economy in a single day. The national press covered it with a mixture of astonishment and amusement. When the dam construction finished and the economic reason for Copperfield's existence disappeared, the town went with it. The site is now beneath the waters of Oxbow Reservoir. A ghost town that a woman shut down with a militia now lies at the bottom of a lake. 1. Astoria Column, Ghost District. Astoria is not a ghost town. It is Oregon's oldest American settlement, a functioning city with a population of around 10,000 and a well-developed tourist infrastructure centered on its Victorian architecture and maritime history. But within Astoria, there is a district that functions as a ghost town inside a living city. A section of the original downtown where fires, economic collapse, and changing commercial patterns left entire blocks of structures standing empty or demolished, visible from the main streets, but almost never discussed in the official version of Astoria's story. The 1922 fire destroyed much of the downtown, and not everything was rebuilt. The gaps left by that rebuilding were widened by the collapse of the cannery industry through the mid-20th century. What remains in that corridor is a layered absence, empty lots where substantial buildings stood, structures preserved from demolition not by designation but by neglect, the outlines of a commercial district that never fully recovered. Astoria tells its history beautifully. It is quieter about the parts that didn't make it. Oregon's ghost towns are not all the same kind of gone. Some were erased by the desert, some were eaten by a dredge. One was shut down by a woman with a militia and then drowned under a reservoir. One was renamed by a cult and still hasn't fully recovered. What they share is the quality of having been real. Places where people built something, believed in it, and eventually had to leave it behind. The state kept growing around them, and the places that couldn't keep up stopped being places at all. Most of them are still out there, waiting at the end of dirt roads and old rail lines, holding whatever the weather hasn't taken yet.